Hi, everyone. Welcome to this panel event hosted by Defense Priorities that we're calling Ukraine's Critical Choice, Pursue Peace or Fight On. My name is Chris McCallion. I'm a fellow here at Defense Priorities, and I'd like to introduce the excellent array of panelists that we have. First up is our own Jennifer Kavanaugh, who is a senior fellow at Defense Priorities and the director of military analysis. She focuses on a whole bunch of issues, including U.S. military strategy, force structure and defense budgeting, defense industrial base, and U.S. military deployments and interventions. Recently, she's the author of an explainer for us called Safeguarding U.S. Interests in a Ukraine War Settlement, and she's written a number of pieces on the issues that we're going to be talking about today in recent months as well. Next up, we have Dr. Gil Barndollar. Gil is a non-resident fellow here at Defense Priorities and a senior research fellow at the Catholic University of America's Center for the Study of Statesmanship. He served as an infantry officer in the United States Marine Corps from 2009 to 2016, deploying to Afghanistan twice, Guantanamo Bay, and to the Persian Gulf. And recently, he is the author of a piece in War on the Rocks called The Deep Strike Dodge, Firepower and Manpower in Ukraine's War. And finally, we have Rob Lee. Rob is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program and a former Marine infantry officer. And Rob has been one of the go-to analysts and one of the go-to accounts throughout this war for anybody trying to make sense of it. So thank you very much to all of you. I'd like to start off with a question about kind of where we are in terms of the war and trying to reach some kind of settlement. Trump administration has been pushing hard to negotiate an end to the war. What do you all see as the critical components to a deal from an American perspective? And at what point, if a deal isn't easily forthcoming, should the U.S. be willing to walk away? Starting with you, Jen.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Chris. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. So I think an important starting point is that in my assessment, the United States has three main priorities in Ukraine at this point. The first is ending its involvement in Ukraine. I think the United States had limited strategic interests in Ukraine from the beginning. Its main goal since Biden got involved almost over 3 years ago now was to prevent Russia from achieving its main objective, which was to take over all of Ukraine. It achieved that goal. And along the way, it was able to impose significant costs on Russia. In some ways, it was even too successful in that second piece, in the sense that now Russia has been able to innovate around a lot of the barriers the United States put up and is quite efficient at funding and supplying its war machine and has increased its defense production. So at this point, the number one U.S. priority has to be to end U.S. involvement, because now the expenses and the continued flow of resources into Ukraine exceeds any interest that the United States has left in how the war terminates. So that's number one. The second goal should be stabilizing the U.S.-Russia relationship. The United States and Russia are the two largest nuclear powers in the world. Having those two countries at odds creates significant escalation and other types of risks, not only for the United States, but also for other countries around the globe. So I think there's a real imperative to address that relationship. And the final goal is ending the war. Because I see ending the war as like the last priority, as something that is neither necessary nor sufficient to achieve the number one and two priorities, I see the option of walking away as quite an appealing one. I don't think that the United States should be willing to pay a high price for a peace deal in Ukraine. I think peace is certainly desirable. We should want the war to end. We should want to end continued civilian and military deaths. But from a U.S. interest perspective, it should not come at any cost. And so, what do I mean by walking away from a bad deal? I think a bad deal would include, number one, a deal in which the United States ends up with long-term security guarantees to Ukraine or a long-term commitment to Ukraine that could look sort of like the U.S.-Israel relationship, which has evolved into a de facto security guarantee and involves about $4 billion in military aid per year, and it's been now ongoing for about 50 years. Those types of long-term commitments don't make sense given limited interest that the United States has in Ukraine's security future. A second bad deal would be a forced surrender that's imposed on Ukraine. I see that as a bad option for the United States because I don't think it will last. The United States has some leverage to force Ukraine to sign a deal, and certainly Zelensky and others in Ukraine aren't going to like or love any deal that requires them to even temporarily give up control of some of the territories that Russia now occupies. But ultimately, Kyiv has to be at least willing to sign on and sort of accept a deal as in their near-term interests. If a deal is imposed, I believe it will collapse, and I think that's very risky because it could end up pulling the United States even deeper in the future. So what do I see as a good deal? I think the key point about a good deal is that it should have Ukraine. It should be centered around Ukraine's armed neutrality or armed non-alignment. That would mean that Ukraine wouldn't have security guarantees or be in NATO or have a European security force inside Ukraine's borders. It wouldn't have U.S. or NATO training or intelligence support. It might be in the EU, but not the military aspects. But it would be armed to defend itself with defensive weapons, which I see as a really attainable goal. And maybe we can talk a little bit about what that looks like over the course of this discussion. So thinking about the timing of when the U.S. should give up on a deal, since it does seem to be more elusive than Trump had hoped, I think basically at any point now, it would be fine for the U.S. to walk away. I think there may be a few more things that the Trump administration might try. Maybe try a harsher oil price cap or some other types of sanctions, secondary sanctions, or taking some of the assets that are frozen in Europe, if European countries are willing to do it, to see if that moves Putin. I'm kind of skeptical that those tools will work. You could try linking the negotiations to some of the broader changes that Putin's hoping for in Europe's security architecture, pulling U.S. forces out of the Baltics or things like that, and see if additional carrots get him to the table. But if those things fail, I think it would be perfectly acceptable from a U.S. interest perspective for the United States to walk away from negotiating to let Ukraine and Russia decide how the war ends. And then separately work with Russia to stabilize the economic and political relationship between the two countries. So I will stop there.
Thanks, Jennifer. Gil, you're up.
Sure. Yeah, I think as Jennifer kind of said, I think the odds of a ceasefire are lengthening. We had these missile strikes in Sumy on Palm Sunday, and I think the civilian death toll from some of these recent attacks is higher. I think, it's been said a lot, but I think Putin is kind of basically thumbing his nose at Trump, or at least at the idea of being pressured into a deal. And I think the Russians, appear, despite slowing progress on the battlefield, to think that their trajectory is a good one, that they are going to be able to bludgeon Ukraine into a harsh peace at a minimum. I think there are reasons why they think that. The manpower trajectory is one of them. I think that they've gotten supplies from kind of their limited partners, from the Iranians, from the North Koreans, and there may be a pretty deep, not bottomless, but a pretty deep well as far as both internal Russian manpower and in terms of the resources they can draw on from these partners of theirs. It's a much written story. The attrition of Russian materiel in terms of artillery, in terms of armored vehicles, and they're using, buggies and electric scooters and even horses for kind of some tactical mobility at the front. But I think they like the trajectory they're on, from the indications I see. That being said, I agree with Jennifer that the U.S. Accepting or even forcing a bad deal is one of the worst possible outcomes. And I think us trying to bludgeon the Ukrainians into a deal that either is not going to hold or is going to be a non-starter. And I know that Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, that interview a couple of weeks ago, he kind of blundered through even the names of the four oblasts that the Russians want. But appeared to suggest that was going to be the goal, and the U.S. was sympathetic to giving Russia all four of those oblasts. And I think that right off the bat is a non-starter. Not only not only the Ukrainians control about a third of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, if they were to concede to that, they would be giving Russia not just the territory that they haven't physically won and may not be able to take, but also positions in Zaporizhia and Kherson. You'd be talking about giving up the west bank of the Dnieper, giving Russia a foothold across the river, a pretty substantial foothold in Kherson. And I think that's a non-starter. That's kind of the final line, and that big natural barrier that Ukraine's defense will rest on in extremis if things get worse. The U.S. and Europe are obviously at cross purposes increasingly. I think, the Europeans are, I think, horrified and shocked by the speed and the vigor with which Trump has not just questioned kind of Ukraine's prospects, but openly kind of conceded a lot of rhetorical points to the Russians, and even minor stuff like this weekend saying that the Sumy strikes were a mistake is not helpful. I think we are potentially looking. I don't necessarily think it's hyperbole. I mean, we're 60 or 80 days into this administration. We may be looking at a point where the U.S. is choosing a rapprochement, which I think a lot of people are going to say is a low odds prospect in any meaningful sense, a rapprochement with Russia versus continued alliance with Europe. And we can, and I'd be the first to do that, to talk about the shortfalls of NATO and the failures of European collective defense. And those are things that run decades deep. But that's a wholly different issue, fixing the alliance or even minimizing the U.S. commitment to breaking it. So I would just say, finally, I guess we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about, should the U.S. walk away from negotiations and from a deal, and should the U.S. walk away from supporting Ukraine altogether? And I would say, the odds, the reason to do the former looks increasingly sound, or the prospects for negotiations look increasingly limited. But I think the cost to the U.S. for continued support to Ukraine, I think, are not nearly as high as maybe portrayed. Jennifer and I may be slightly at odds there. I think the escalation risks, and that's the foremost issue, right, is preventing nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia. I think those risks are low and pretty manageable, and have been for some time now. I think they were pretty high in the beginning of the war, and I think the Biden administration was right to keep that uppermost and to be very cautious in some ways in terms of how it supplied Ukraine and how it helped the Ukrainians to defend themselves. But I think those risks are dramatically different than they were in 2022 or even 2023. I think the risk to U.S. kind of readiness and military supplies, I think that's ultimately up to us. And I think we're seeing far greater impacts on any kind of Pacific, war with China kind of scenario from what we're doing in the Middle East right now than from support to Ukraine. There are certain assets, obviously, especially air defense, that really are finite. Things like artillery and armored vehicles really are only there for a European contingency or maybe a war in the Korean Peninsula. I think the risk of distraction, though, is probably uppermost, and that I do think that the U.S. has bigger strategic issues around the world than the war in Ukraine, and I think that right now you've got Steve Witkoff, I think, simultaneously supposedly negotiating with Russia and negotiating with Iran. So there's a bandwidth issue there, and I think the United States does struggle, despite being the preeminent global power, to walk and chew gum a lot of the time. So to me, that is the biggest cost to continue support for Ukraine. But we obviously have the ability to throttle that cost. And some things, advising and intelligence, are a very cheap way to give the Ukrainians major advantages. Military supplies are kind of a bit of a more variable issue. So I'll stop it there and turn it over to Rob, who I think is going to talk about the prospects of Ukraine fighting alone.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. So I'll make, I guess, a couple points on what you guys are just saying. I personally believe that Ukraine's survival and ideally prosperity is quite important strategically for the U.S. I think its survival is critical for European security, and I think European security is a vital U.S. national security interest. We talk about deals. Whatever kind of deal that ends this war, it's important that it actually has some kind of permanence to it, because there's a risk that they come to some kind of deal and then Russia, reneges on this a year later, 2 years later, they reinvade. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it's important that there's a deal that has, some kind of long-term, some kind of a way of preventing Russia from invading again, some ability to strengthen Ukraine to deter future Russian invasion. And I know there are different options and people have proposed different options for it, but at a minimum, I think continued U.S. aid or NATO aid to Ukraine is going to be vital for that. And I think making Ukraine as difficult to invade and make it as painful as possible if Russia tries to invade it again in the future is an important kind of goal. In terms of prospects right now, I've been somewhat pessimistic about the prospects of negotiations when the Trump administration came in, mostly because Russia still has quite maximalist objectives for this war. Vladimir Putin last year in June 2024 laid out his kind of minimum demands for ceasefire, and those demands involved Ukraine giving up all the four regions that are fighting in right now, and Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk. All four of them Russia partially occupies, but Ukraine still controls most of them, except much of them. Luhansk is mostly Russian control at this point. But that's become a key issue of the debate now about a deal. And as Gil mentioned, Steve Witkoff apparently believes that's kind of the route to ending this war. But it's really a non-starter. I don't think President Zelensky could do this. I don't think it's politically possible to give up territory that Ukraine currently controls. It would be a bitter pill to end the war without taking back the rest of the territory that they don't control, but especially to give up the territory they currently control. And keep in mind, Zaporizhia, that includes the capital city. It's a very large city. It's economically important to Ukraine. So a lot of this, when talking about the long-term implications of Ukraine's survival and prosperity, these things are quite important. And some of these regions also have important minerals, other kind of economic components that are important to Ukraine's long-term prosperity. So, I personally think that because Russia still has these very maximalist goals, and that Russia right now is, they're still currently advancing the battlefield. Their advance of the winter slowed down. They reached a peak in November on a monthly basis. It was the fastest rate of Russian advance since March of 2022. Over the winter, that slowed down, I think, for a variety of reasons. I think partially for reconstitution, partially because of weather, partially because the Biden administration sent over a large amount of ammunition at the end of its time in office. But now with the spring coming and the summer, we're seeing an uptick in Russian fighting. We obviously know the Ukraine's control of Kursk is they've lost almost all of it at this point. It's a question of where Russia will redeploy the units that were in Kursk, whether they'll try and push across in Sumy or redeploy elsewhere. I suspect the intensity of the fighting is going to increase again this summer. And my view is that as long as Russia can sustain this war and they haven't achieved their most limited objectives, and they're advancing the battlefield, I think the war is probably going to continue. And again, right now, from Russia's perspective, at a minimum, they want to occupy all of Donetsk, Luhansk. For the Donetsk, they have a long way to go. I mean, they've been fighting around Pokrovsk for about 7 to 8 months now. There's some other cities like Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstaha, and others that they still are far away from taking. And so, I think the war is going to continue. And I think that the extent to which the U.S. can influence this, it's really by strengthening Ukraine's hands, right? I don't think negotiations are likely to have much success as long as Russia's advancing on the battlefield, even if it's slowly. And so I think the key to achieving any kind of deal is that the U.S. should continue providing Ukraine with as much military as feasible to try and prevent further Russian advances. And then if Russia comes to understand that they can't advance any further, that their missile strikes can't force Ukraine into making concessions, then maybe there are prospects for negotiations at that point. But I think up until that point, I think it's going to be a bit unlikely. And we've seen that so far, right? We've seen the kind of Ukraine agreed to a broader ceasefire. Russia did not agree to one. We know that Russia continues to conduct strikes on infrastructure across Ukraine over the last month, and I suspect that's going to continue. So my view is that I think the conditions for successful negotiations are not here yet. I think there's going to be more fighting required before both sides are ready to kind of make any kind of negotiations. And I think from the U.S. perspective, our ability to influence this comes from providing additional aid and further support to Ukraine. Because I think if we pull back, that Russia is going to take that as a sign they're going to continue trying to advance. So that's my kind of view on U.S. support. And one of the big questions now is that the Trump administration has been in office for a few months. The Biden administration sent over a significant amount of ammunition before it left office, but without another U.S. aid package, right, we're getting to the point where the effects are going to be felt in Ukraine. For some of the munitions, like Patriot interceptors, those are only coming from the U.S. and that is the main ballistic missile defense system for Ukraine. That is their main way of defending cities against ballistic missile strikes, like from Iskanders. That the Iskander is what hit Sumy recently. They're also using Kyiv. One got through, I think, last week. So Patriots are very, very important. There are other systems like for HIMARS, like GIMLRS munitions that come from the U.S. And of course, intelligence sharing. And then about some of the half the artillery ammunition Ukraine gets has been coming from the U.S. too. Some of that can be compensated by Europe or other means, but for some of these things, without U.S. aid, it's going to put Ukraine in a much more precarious position. And so the U.S. ability to kind of influence the negotiations is going to probably depend on passing the aid package. And if we don't do that, I think we're going to lose leverage over negotiations in general.
Thanks, Rob. I want to pick up on that a little bit, and I'll try to resist my temptation to roll too many questions into one. But want to ask about how those developments on the battlefield are shaping possible outcomes. Because as you mentioned, the Russians have retaken seemingly most of Kursk, and that incursion really kind of came at the expense of a fair amount of territory within Ukraine. So that, I think it's reasonable to argue that incursion was a net negative for Ukraine. So it's possible, of course. I mean, there's no way to make predictions about the Trump administration and what it's going to do. But if we do assume that there is a diminishing public appetite for continuing to support Ukraine within the United States, where does that leave Ukraine in terms of its window for negotiating? It's obviously it has manpower and firepower problems that are, we can expect will only get worse over time. So how does that shape Ukraine's options? And do we assume that Russia feels that time is on its side and that it's worth just continuing the war as long as possible so that they can just wear down Ukraine and that they'll have better negotiating options down the line?
Sure. I mean, I think Russia does think time is on its side. I think some of the public discourse maybe about the U.S. Potentially not continue to support Ukraine might kind of play a role in this. But I also think, as you mentioned, the manpower situation is a problem. It was the most significant problem in 2024 for Ukraine. It is still a problem now, right? The mobilization rate, Russia, they continue to recruit a large number of soldiers every month. Last year, according to Ukraine's defense intelligence, Russia recruited about 440,000, contract soldiers. This year, the plan I think is about for 330,000. And for January and February, they met their quotas. They exceeded their quotas, so that they are still getting 30,000, 35,000 guys a month, which is more than Ukraine. Obviously, for Ukraine, it's easier to defend with fewer troops than when you're not doing offensive operations. AWOL is also a problem for Ukraine too, so that's also kind of part of the manpower issue. But one thing Ukraine has done is that they've innovated quite a bit with UAVs. UAV production in Ukraine is scaled dramatically. Right, there are FPV producers in Ukraine that produce 4,000 FPVs per day. The capacity for additional production is there if it is funded properly. So we're seeing European countries that are funding Ukraine's defense industry, and they can really produce quite a bit. The quality of their UAVs is increasing. And so, they can compensate, to some extent, right? There's no way of compensating entirely for lack of manpower, but it's going to be one of the questions we see this year is to what extent is this possible through UAVs and through UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, which can, because the most dangerous thing, the most casualties that Ukraine sustains is when infantry rotate to and from the front line. If you can use kind of ground robots to move equipment, ammunition, you can try and kind of lessen that risk somewhat. So, we're going to see to what extent Ukraine can compensate for lack of manpower through innovation. And, we are seeing some successes. They are scaling some of these UAV units. So they are operating much more effectively and efficiently. I think some parts of the front line were in Pokrovsk, where Russia's really not advanced much the last few months. I think that is a key reason why is what they deployed quite capable UAV units there. They're making it difficult for Russia to advance even to the front line. But as you said, if Ukraine loses US aid, there's going to be a question for things with the Patriots. That's going to be the main one. President Zelensky mentioned recently that Ukraine's open to purchasing Patriots themselves. I assume through kind of with European support, that's an option where maybe the U.S. provides weapons if they're purchased by Europe for Ukraine. Patriots are really the most important one, but there are other options too. But I will say, in terms of artillery and other ammunition, artillery I think was by far the most important kind of weapon system in 2022. It's still very important, but it is declined relatively to what it was in 2022, 2023, just because now the main casualty producing weapon for Ukraine are UAVs, right? For eliminating armored vehicles and for infantry. And so to some extent, right, Ukraine can compensate domestically through their own kind of internal production. So I think there are ways that they can compensate, but as you said, Russia right now, and there's an argument about whether or not Russia is kind of losing the attritional fight. And, they're taking heavier casualties, but it's a bigger country. They have more resources. There's, pretty little political sensitivity to casualties in Russia. And for the time being, they are still getting enough, soldiers to continue kind of fighting the way they are fighting. What does that lead to? Right. Right now, it doesn't look like we're going to see a breakthrough in the near future from Russia, but I suspect we're going to continue to see these kind of grinding advances by Russia. How far does that get? We'll have to see. But, without U.S. aid, it will make it more difficult. I think Europe can help compensate, but we'll have to wait and see. And as I mentioned before, I think Patriots are really the main kind of component here. Where without that, the war could become much more difficult for Ukraine.
Can I weigh in on this question?
Go ahead.
So I don't think the time is on Ukraine's side. I think basically every week that goes by, Ukraine's bargaining position gets worse. I don't think there will be another aid package. I think there's just no political will for that among the current Congress, especially given that they are still grappling with this reconciliation bill and have a long way to go on that with all of Trump's legislative priorities. Currently, Republican support for continued support to Ukraine is at 30%. Independence is like 50%. So I think public opinion is really shifting against this. And, that's a separate question whether the public is responding to elite cues or whether this is their, whether they're generating the opinions and policymakers are following them. It's the age-old debate. But in any case, there's no public support for it. So I don't think there'll be another aid package. It's an option for Ukraine or Europe to try to buy weapons from the United States, but ultimately the Pentagon has to approve the sales. And given the priorities that the Pentagon has set out, I think that they'll be hesitant to, even if the money is there, to send a lot of Patriot missiles and other capabilities that they're really looking at as key, both in the Middle East, where they have, despite their strategic intent, committed a ton of resources, as Gil mentioned before, and in Asia, which they have identified as their priority. So I guess I see the prospects of continued U.S. military assistance to Ukraine as dwindling, including for Patriot missiles, even if there is money on the table from Europe. I think that Ukraine's in a very difficult strategic position. I agree that they're pretty much completely self-sufficient in terms of drones, and drones can get them a lot of the way on some things, but they do require Western capabilities. And I don't think Europe at this point in the near term can make up for what they're lacking. Europe could make a bigger difference in defensive capabilities that would help Ukraine really harden its defenses in ways that prevent Russia from making any more gains, which would achieve the same end goal that Rob is talking about of sort of forcing Russia to recognize that it doesn't have, it's not going to make a lot more territorial gains. But that's a different strategy, and I haven't seen all that much talk about what it would take to actually just fortify defenses, rather than thinking about long missiles and other types of capabilities, thinking about just landmines and digging trenches and things like that. Ukraine's made progress on that, but there's still a lot of gaps. So I think the other key factor here is that I think there's a big risk that Trump gets frustrated and walks away. And that's not a risk from my perspective, because as I said before, I think walking away is an acceptable U.S. strategy. But from Ukraine's perspective, I'm not sure that's a good thing. Given where they are in terms of their military capabilities, I think it would give Putin a pretty free hand to press Ukraine into an even more unfavorable settlement. Um, so to me, it's really Ukraine's choice here is the key one. I don't think they have a lot of cards to play. I didn't love the optics of the Oval Office meeting, but I agree with Trump's main message. And I see them as in a really tough position. And that contrasts with Zelensky's rhetoric, which is still quite maximalist at times. So, I think that's sort of my read here of of how time and military capabilities play out. I don't think surging military assistance to Ukraine is really on the table as an option. And therefore, I think we need to think about other strategies for either getting Russia to the table or extracting the U.S. in another way.
Yeah, let me chime in real quickly with something Jennifer said early on, and that's on U.S. public opinion, because I think that's still going to be a big piece of this going forward. And I do think increasingly in a hyper-polarized age, public opinion here is thermostatic. And I think that as you've got to look at the bigger picture, and I think the Trump administration, the trajectory they're on right now, again, we're shy of 90 days in, and the economic, the foreign policy in a lot of ways, the domestic trajectory in a host of ways is pretty negative. And I think that if Trump is attached increasingly to a position of enabling Russia, if that's not an overstatement, and maybe it's not, and is increasingly hostile towards Ukraine, that's going to have political salience in the U.S. and is probably going to increasingly push people to a renewed support for Ukraine. I don't think that's out of the question. I agree that certainly on the Hill, support for Ukraine is much lower than it was even a year ago, after getting that last big aid package through, almost exactly a year ago. I think that's all true. I think there's not going to be probably a next aid package in the near future. I think if the Ukrainians are thinking in those terms, they've got to be thinking kind of from the midterms on. But I think the idea that this is only a one-way street in terms of U.S. public opinion and European public opinion, for that matter, I think there's much more. That's a much more dynamic situation. And to Jennifer's kind of final point, I think that Ukraine does have a sort of dance to play and doesn't have a tremendous amount of leverage. And you watch Zelensky most publicly, but Ukraine in general, kind of try to walk that tightrope of not, occasionally sniping at kind of U.S. actors and maybe the vice president more so because of the tenor of how he talks, but also realizing they need to try to keep Trump in particular sort of on side and more annoyed or angered by Russian intransigence than by Ukrainian resistance to talks. And I think that's a kind of narrow tightrope to walk, but I think it's doable.
If we can jump in real quick, in terms of domestic opinion, I think domestic opinion is often shaped by what's going on the battlefield at any point in time. And overall, the situation on the battlefield has been relatively decent for Ukraine the last few months, right? So Kursk is the exception, where Russia took that area back, but Russian advances elsewhere in Ukraine slowed down across the winter. And I think a lot of times public perception is kind of shaped by what we're seeing. If the situation gets worse this summer, right, I think public opinion will shift. I think it will shift and say, we should be doing more. We're not doing enough for Ukraine. In particular, Patriots will be a kind of key argument here because they're seen as a defensive weapon. Obviously, all weapons have defensive and offensive capabilities, but Patriots are there to help defend Ukrainian cities, defend Ukrainian infrastructure. And if Russia has more success with strikes on cities and we are not providing Patriots, I think that will also be a kind of effective political argument saying that the U.S. should do more. I think that will also resonate a lot more with many Americans. So I think right now the situation the last few months has been better. I suspect the situation will get more difficult as the weather changes. And then public opinion might shift too, and more Americans might say we should be doing more. And at a minimum, I think from the Trump administration, having Ukraine lose more territory or have the war go worse for Ukraine, I don't think anyone in the Trump administration think that's a good thing for the U.S. And yes, they're trying to push through a deal. The issue right now is that any kind of deal, I think the two, both sides, Russia and Ukraine, are not going to come to a negotiation, are not going to come to any kind of agreement because their positions are very, very far apart right now. And I don't think it's really possible for the U.S. to kind of push in an agreement that will achieve this anytime soon. And so it's a question of whether or not the U.S. kind of provide that support or not. And if we aren't providing that support, I do think U.S. popular opinion will change. I think more Americans will say we should be doing more for Ukraine. We're not doing enough. And if the situation on the battlefield gets worse for Ukraine, I think that'll ultimately kind of shape domestic opinion here as well.
So I guess I'm curious, because that didn't happen when you, like, at other points when Ukraine has been struggling on the battlefield, like in the long fight over the last supplemental, right? That lasted for like months. If you look at the public opinion line, it's like a straight line decreasing over time. So I guess I'm wondering why you expect that this time it will be different than in the past, and also what evidence we have that the Trump administration is concerned about Russia's territorial gains on the battlefield. I mean, I haven't seen any evidence from any Trump official that that's like a factor that they have really considered. I mean, I think they just assume that, Witkoff has talked about like all 4 of those or all 5 of those territories in their entirety. But for most part, it seemed like most officials were assuming that the line would fall where the line of contact is when the ceasefire occurs, and that's that. And there wasn't all that much concern. So I guess I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on those 2 points a little bit.
Sure. So on the second one, I don't necessarily just disagree with you in that I don't think the movement of the front line is necessarily the priority for the Trump administration if it's somewhat small. But I think when we talk about how the war ends, right? If the deal that is being offered by the Trump administration is for Ukraine to give up all those regions, that's going to be a very bitter pill for Ukraine to swallow. I don't think Ukraine is going to go for it. I also think that if Ukraine loses Zaporizhia, as other key cities, the country becomes a bit less viable as a long-term entity, right? Because it will lose much of its kind of economic power. There's a big negotiation about the Zaporizhia power plant, about where that's going to go, because Russia currently occupies it. But if it's a really bad deal and it becomes a sense of resentment with Ukraine, there are all sorts of kind of negative, domestic political kind of events that can occur that lead this to not being something that's long-term viable. And it can, I think Ukraine's long-term viability is very much depends on ending this war in a kind of way that Ukrainians can accept and is somewhat favorable for them. And so I think that if Russia keeps making gains and they actually start to achieve something greater, I think there might be a perception that the U.S. is losing here, that this is kind of weakening the U.S. I don't know. You probably know this better than I do, but I think that there might be a perception in the Trump administration that is against U.S. interests. I think it would be, and I think they might kind of recognize this. In terms of public polling, the last thing I saw, and might be looking at different polling, was that the number of Americans who think we're not doing enough has spiked. There was a poll a couple weeks ago. I think it was from Pew, but I could be wrong. I agree with you. Your overall numbers have kind of declined. But I think, again, it comes back to, I think the debate we're hearing right now in the U.S. is about, a lot of Americans think it's about freezing the front line where it is right now to end the war. And that's not what's being negotiated, right? Russia is demanding more territory that it does not control, as well as a number of additional things, concessions from Ukraine. If the offer on that was available was just for Ukraine to say, we're going to freeze the war, the front line where it is, and we'll end it right now, I think that would be, something quite different. And so I think a lot of Americans' perceptions about what kind of is on offer for this kind of deal is a bit different. And so it also influences their views of how much support should the U.S. be providing and what does that look like. So again, I think we'll see. The ceasefire obviously has not led to the outcomes that anyone, I think, hoped for. I don't think we're going to see a really durable, more expansive ceasefire in the near future. And let's see about public opinion polling. But I think that the situation gets worse for Ukraine. And of course, the strike in Sumy is something that Americans see, right? It happened on Palm Sunday. I don't think, that feeds into this argument from Ukraine saying they need more patriots from the U.S. They need this kind of support. I think that could affect U.S. domestic polling.
Let me hop in just a couple of quick things on that too. I think the longer this goes on, the more the Trump administration is going to own it, right? I mean, you can see that even in kind of the most overt rhetoric from the principal himself, right? I mean, Trump had some longer tweet the other day or whatever, Truth Social thing, where he, went off and said, I didn't start this war. This happened on Biden's watch. But this long kind of, exposition on that. So I think he undoubtedly realizes that. So the longer this grinds on, the more it's going to be on his doorstep. That's inevitable. And the more that situation obtains, it's going to be harder and harder for him to walk away without owning the consequences of that. And I think, Rob kind of spoke to this a little bit, and we could probably unpack it more. those consequences are a lot less than they would have been in a year ago, 2 years ago, certainly at the beginning of the war. The Ukrainians are much more self-sufficient, like we said, in terms of particular drone munitions. European rearmament is finally kind of fitfully going forward. And I think the European willingness to dip into military stocks, which was always pretty high, especially for some smaller countries, has probably increased. So I think the U.S., is, even though U.S. support, especially intelligence, especially air defense, as Rob said, even though that's still an enormous piece of the equation for Ukraine, the U.S. has less leverage to bend the Ukrainians into a bad or unacceptable deal than they did. I think all three of us probably agree on that. So I think there's that issue. The longer this goes on, the more Trump owns it, the more, even if he temperamentally or strategically, if we want to be charitable, wants to walk away, I think that's harder and harder to do. And then to the politics of it, I think for better or worse, these things are all increasingly personalist. We're seeing that in our country, and we see that with regard to Russia. So, when you talk about Ukraine to any kind of domestic political audience, the specter of Putin and what he's done gets invoked, right? And you're not, even among a Republican audience, aside from a not small but also not majority chunk on the real kind of far right, you're not going to detoxify Vladimir Putin. 70% plus of Americans think he's a villain, a kind of the villain in the situation. You can say that's a simplistic understanding of international affairs, so be it. But that's really what the framing is in most people's minds. And to Rob's point, if we were to pull back or cancel air defense, especially for Ukrainian cities, and we are seeing what we saw on Palm Sunday, regular strikes and dozens of civilians killed on a regular basis, that does have an impact. And I think the Ukrainians have occasional deep strike raids into Moscow, but there's no analog. I mean, they're not going to be killing Russian civilians, and they're not going to be, again, in a simple but basically correct moral framing, they're not going to be the bad guys in this war, right? And I think these things do matter. They matter to a European audience, and they will matter to a U.S. audience, especially with kind of razor-tight margins, with a midterm election coming up that is on pace to probably be a bloodbath for Republicans. These things do have real salience.
One thing I think might be clarifying is to try to drill down on what the interests of all the parties involved are at this point, because I think those have shifted over the course of the war. I can't remember the last time that I might be wrong here, but I can't remember the last time that somebody has talked about how Ukraine is going to retake Crimea, for instance, right? So at this point, when we're talking about what a realistic end to this war might look like, what are the main objectives that Ukraine has? What are the objectives that we think the Russians have? And what are the to some extent, you've all made some kind of statements regarding this, but what really are the interests at this point that the U.S. has at stake? What does it risk concretely if it were to withdraw, right? Rob, you had said that Ukraine matters to European security and European security matters to the U.S., but, people define those interests differently, right? What European security means is right. I would define that interest as being wanting to prevent a hegemon on the rimland of the Eurasian supercontinent, right? Which is a bit different than I think the way that our interests in Europe have been defined lately. It's a difficult argument to make, for instance, that Ukraine, with the right amount of assistance, can win the war against Russia, and then on the other hand, to say that Russia is poised to run over the European continent, right? So, what are the interests of these three parties at this point, and what are the objectives that they can realistically attain? And maybe we'll start again with Jennifer and go in that order again.
Sure. So, on U.S. interests, I really, to be honest, don't think the United States has many interests at this point left in Ukraine. I think the United States could walk away, and any sort of outcome that occurred in Ukraine the United States would be fine. I agree that the picture looks very different from Europe, but I don't believe that any outcome in Ukraine fundamentally makes Putin more likely to invade the rest of NATO Europe or more capable of doing so. And I believe that if anything, the United States walking away would really push Europe into arming itself more effectively, in which case it would be increasingly difficult for Putin to accomplish any real objectives in Europe. So I don't think the U.S. has many interests at stake from just a pure interest perspective. I understand that people might, the American public might have sympathy towards Ukraine, especially if there were increasing strikes on civilian cities, but that's separate from what are the cold hard national interests. I think Ukraine, I think its fundamental interest should be to prevent Russia from taking any more territory, preserve the rest of its territory, and rebuild so that it can protect itself, retain its sovereignty, and build an economically prosperous Ukraine in the territory it still controls. I think that there are those in Ukraine, including perhaps Zelensky, who see Ukrainian interests as broader, as requiring regaining territory that it's lost. And I certainly understand that. I think it's unrealistic that they'll be able to achieve that, certainly in the near term and probably in the long term. So I think that aiming for that goal puts the rest of Ukraine's sovereignty at risk. Because in continuing to fight, as I said before, I think time is not on Ukraine's side. And I think that their position just erodes in ways that could mean that they lose additional territory or have to settle on terms that are essentially Putin's. And what he would ultimately would like is to control Ukraine politically, if not territorially. And so then that gets to, Russia's interests. I think Russia's main goal here, if it can't territorially control all of Ukraine, it wants to be able to politically control Ukraine. So have a puppet government or a government that it has significant influence over. It does not want Ukraine to have a military force that's strong enough, certainly not strong enough to retake territories that it's lost, and probably not strong enough to really defend itself so that the threat of a Russian reinvasion is a disciplining force. But I think Russia also has other interests. I think that they put on a brave face about their economic resilience in the face of Western sanctions, but I think their economy is suffering. It's basically surviving based on military production at this point. There's very high interest rates, very high inflation. So I do think that they want sanctions relief. I think they want to at least stabilize the economic relationship with the West. I think they love a more a stable political relationship with the United States as well. And a position back on the stage as they see themselves, which is as a great power, even though they don't really have the GDP to justify that position. I think that's what they'd like. I think I'm not sure those goals are attainable. Certainly not the territorial goals. I think sanctions relief is probably possible, especially from the United States. I think a better relationship with the United States is probably possible. And in terms of political control over Ukraine, I mean, I think in the ideal world, a peace deal wouldn't sacrifice Ukraine's sovereignty. It would give it the military power to control its borders and a government that is sovereign from Russia. And I think there are those in the Trump administration who recognize that as a key goal. They're not looking to serve Ukraine on a plate to Putin. They're not that interested in the territory question. But I think they do recognize that there is a value in having Ukraine able to defend itself. So I'm not that optimistic about Putin getting kind of its what he sees as maximalist Russian interests either.
Yeah, and I mean the real question, to clarify what I really want to get a sense of is what are the interests that they think are actually achievable, right? I'm sure Ukraine wants to retake all the territory it's lost, and I'm sure that Russia, has very ambitious objectives inside Ukraine. But at this point, right, it seems unlikely that Ukraine's going to be able to retake, for example, the territory in those 4 oblasts. And at the same time, it's not clear that Russia has the ability to conquer the entirety of those 4 oblasts. So what are the I guess what I'm trying to get to is there some point in sight where the two sides are stalemated, some equilibrium is reached on the battlefield where they have to come to the table with each other, even in the absence of continuing U.S. aid?
Well, I think that the question lingering in the background there. I mean, it's an attritional war. That's obviously kind of been clear for a while now. And Russia, it's a much larger country, kind of 4x as large, give or take, and seems to have manpower reserves that, if not inexhaustible, they have an awful lot of, call it what it is, kind of superfluous men in the hinterlands of the country that they can keep putting in uniform and grinding in. And that's a real, I mean, to me, that's the biggest problem Ukraine faces, is that imbalance, more so than the munitions imbalance, more so than the economic imbalance, more so than kind of the frontline tactical situation, is that dynamic. So, and I think, I wouldn't disagree really with any of kind of Jennifer's analysis there, but I guess the bigger question as far as the United States is, do we, how much do we want to try to make a grand realignment strategically and try to peel Russia away from increasing alignment with China? That appears to be the Trump administration goal, right? I mean, at the minor end, to kind of lower tensions. Again, I don't think the escalation risk is really that high. I think that we are kind of in a stasis there. I think there are some, I think, kind of strange mercantilist kind of goals of the Trump administration that are ultra transactional and really, in the case of Ukraine, kind of imperial on both ends in terms of from Ukraine and from Russia. But I think fundamentally on the U.S. side, we need to decide how much we care about European security or about the NATO alliance altogether. I agree that you see the rhetoric from even kind of major political leaders. The Russians aren't going to gallop into Warsaw, let alone Berlin, in the wake of this war, or potentially maybe ever. But I think, there's some intelligence analysis that came out from, I think, some of the Baltic states, some of the Nordic countries, and elsewhere. And those are countries that have a vested interest and are closer to Russia and can see themselves being at war with Russia in the near term, depending on how things break politically. But it'll take the Russians a while to reconstitute. And I know there have been some reports on this coming out of U.S. think tanks increasingly, no question, from both a manpower, but especially from a materiel standpoint. But I don't think it's crazy to think that if things went Russia's way in a big sense in Ukraine, they reduced Ukraine to a rump state that was no longer a bulwark against Russia, that was unable to provide that kind of hedge, which is, I think, how the Europeans increasingly see it, and was sort of there at Russia's mercy, whether they're on as I said, the west bank of the Dnieper, and they've reduced Ukraine to not even kind of a porcupine or sort of an armed neutral, but a state they don't really have to reckon with. There absolutely, I think, is a chance the Russians do think seriously about going into the Baltics and using that, depending on largely on U.S. Messaging and where the U.S. stands in relation to NATO, and looking at that as an opportunity to break the alliance. And the Baltics, are just a much different strategic proposition than Ukraine. It's just that there's not the strategic depth, both in terms of manpower or just territory. So I don't think that's a crazy thing to think. I don't think the Russians have aims of driving, tanks into Berlin, like I said. But I think there are other outcomes, and he just needs to decide. I take Jennifer's point in sort of the most narrow strategic sense. Does what happens on the battlefield in Ukraine directly impact American security? No. Does the broader trajectory of Europe, and do we ultimately, for all of its faults, for all of its pitfalls and buck passing and lack of equitable burden sharing on its own defense, do we ultimately want to be aligned with NATO? And that's a much bigger, grand strategic question that weighs in on trade, that weighs in on kind of our trajectory versus China. But ultimately, do we still want to keep Europe close to the United States as an imperfect collection of allies through the mechanism of NATO, or do we want to essentially make our way to cutting those ties and stand increasingly alone? I think that's a much thornier question. I think Ukraine is a big piece of where that goes.
Rob, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. So a couple points I'd make. So from your question, how this war ends is quite important, right? It's important that Ukraine's long-term survival, as that they're a good prospect for economic growth, right? There are reasons for Ukrainians to believe there's not going to be another invasion immediately, a year from now, 2 years from now, so on. Because when martial law ends, right, a lot of people may try to leave, right? And so it really depends how the war ends, about how much of an exodus we see of Ukrainian civilians. And that could be refugees, right? And of course, there are a lot of Ukrainians who are living in Europe, elsewhere at this point, right? Many of them are not going to return, but some will return. But there is this question about, Ukraine's long-term viability. And as Jill mentioned, right, Russian maximalist goals in this war They thought they could achieve them at low cost. They didn't, right? The costs have been quite high. But if they can, neuter Ukraine and make it into this kind of failed state, I think some in Russia will view that as kind of a win, right? And some of that might be through the conventional war. Some of it might be through manipulation post-war, right? If Ukrainians don't feel they got a fair deal, if they thought they were abandoned by Western countries, so they shouldn't pursue integration into the West or different kind of things. I think there are a lot of different scenarios that could happen. In some ways, I think the risk for a peace deal are greater on the Ukrainian side, because for Russia, it's easy for Putin to kind of sell whatever deal he has to Russians, where they say, okay, the war's over. It was a high cost, but what have you. I think for Ukraine, it's going to be a bitter pill to swallow, to say, okay, we're not necessarily acknowledging that Russia occupies, Crimea, all these other territory in Ukraine, but we're not actively trying to retake it right now, right? And because a lot of Ukrainians have family members in the occupied areas, and they want to see them again, and it's not a small issue for them. So I think that's still a big problem. I think for Ukraine, it offers Europe a lot security-wise. The Ukrainians have the most recent experience in a real conventional war. There are a lot of Ukrainian operators who all have a tremendous amount of experience that'd be very useful for NATO militaries. The Ukraine defense industry has innovated quite a bit. In Ukraine, the best engineers and IT people are either in the Ukrainian military or they're working on UAVs, defense technology, so on. So they're innovating much faster than we are, and they can test their UAVs immediately. And so in the U.S., if we try and come with a UAV and we want to test it in a GPS denied environment, it takes a half a year or more than a year to do that, right? In Ukraine, you can do it in a week. And so they have that immediate feedback. I think there's a lot of things that Ukraine can offer to Europe and to improve their militaries and improve their ability to kind of defend against Russia in the future too. As Jill mentioned, for Russia, this war was a lot of it was about Ukraine specifically, but a lot of it was about European security architecture. They failed, initially to kind of reset the security architecture. We know the demands they made in December 2021 about NATO. We still have questions about what they can achieve with Ukraine. I still don't think the Baltics, right, makes sense for an invasion. I don't think that Russia does something they want necessarily in Estonia or Latvia, but right, Russia conducted this kind of this war that was maximalist in nature. I thought it was strategically kind of crazy to attempt what they did, and so I don't think we can completely say there's no chance that Russia would try to use force again against a NATO country. I think it's possible, and I think it's important that we have some ability to kind of deter that in the future. But I think for Russia, their objectives in this war at this point, at minimum, is take all of Donetsk and Luhansk, right? They can sell that as saying we took back the Donbass. That was a kind of official goal of the war anyway. They're still far away from doing that. But they'll take whatever they can achieve. And I think Jennifer's right. I think sanctions relief. I think normalization relations are other goals that Russia has. They probably think they have a better chance of the Trump administration than with previous administrations. We'll see if that's possible. We'll see if Europe is willing to buy gas from Russia again the same way they were before. I'm not sure they want to make that choice, but it's possible. I still think as you're saying about what is possible in terms of this war, a lot of this war has been dictated by, I think, bad political choices that affected military outcomes, where I think military decision-making was very, very much influenced by short-term or medium-term political kind of choices on both sides that had, led to kind of bad results. For Russia's made a number of very significant mistakes in this war. I think if they mobilized in the spring of 2022, I don't think that Ukraine would have had the success they had in Kherson and Kharkiv in the fall of 2022. A lot of these things were just, significant errors. So we talk about what's possible in this war. It is possible Russia makes greater mistakes going forward, right? It's possible they overextend. It's possible they leave themselves vulnerable. I don't think it's impossible to say Ukraine can take back territory. I don't think taking back Crimea is likely. But there are possibilities here that I don't think we should kind of completely eliminate. But I think for Ukraine at this point, their priority is to preserve a state for Ukrainians, right? To preserve sovereignty and to preserve a country that has a long-term viability. And I think that's still a very critical goal. It's also going to be critical whenever martial law ends that we don't have an exodus of Ukrainians, that people want to live in Ukraine. We know they had demographic problems. And so there are all sorts of things that Ukraine's leadership has to think through. It's not just about territory, although territory is part of it. But again, I think Ukraine would be willing to come to a deal that ends the war with the current front line. But I don't think if they give up much more territory, I think that's going to be very, very difficult kind of sell for President Zelensky to make. And I think politically it probably will be unpalatable.
Well, as usual with these kinds of discussions, I feel like we've just scratched the surface by the time we get to the end. So I want to thank Rob, Gil, and Jennifer for this excellent conversation, and for everyone at home who's been watching. Thanks a lot, and take care.